Hi, this is Vivian Vande Velde here to read you chapter 13 of Ghost of a Hanged Man, a spooky story that I wrote quite a few years ago. It was originally published by Marshall Cavendish. I am reading a chapter a day. There are 15 chapters in all, and this is chapter 13 of a spooky story that is getting spookier, and I hope you're enjoying it. Chapter 13 is called Three of Swords. They covered the coffin back up, partly because everyone figured a used coffin shouldn't be left open, and partly, I think, because we were all sort of hoping Jake was still really in there and that we just couldn't see him. Then everybody went home fast, leaving me, Annabelle, Pa, and Emmett Sanders. I suspect people feared that Jake Barnett might send bolts of lightning to get the four of us, and nobody wanted to be standing too close to us, just in case. Back at his office, Pa told us, "There's a perfectly reasonable explanation for all this." Then he sighed loudly. "But I have no idea what it could be." He rested his head in his hands. "Xandra said there was magic coming," Annabelle said. She no longer seemed to find all this amusing. "Magic and sorrow and changes, lots of changes." "Who's Xandra?" Emmett asked. Pa raised his head. He ignored Emmett and asked us, "What else did she say?" "That Jake Barnett is getting stronger and stronger," I told him, "and that we should have buried him while there was still time." "Where is this girl, Xandra?" Pa asked. "Gone." Why did I feel as though she'd abandoned us? She had no call to stay. And even if she had stayed, what power did she have besides the ability to see our own doom coming? I said, "She and her family left town this morning. They were worried about people blaming them." "Why don't we go too?" Annabelle suggested. "The four of us?" Pa asked, including Emmett, with a wave of his hand, since we were all in this together. I was nodding too. He continued, "Pack up everything, start all over again, someplace where we don't know anybody, and assume—" He bit off what he had started to say. "What?" I asked. Pa looked away. He hated to admit it, but he finished, "That someone who can travel back from the grave can't cross town not can't cross town lines." I hadn't thought of that. Annabelle started to cry, and Pa pulled her to him in a hug. "We'll stay together," he said. "The four of us. He can't get all four of us at once, Annie, can he? He went after each of the others when they were alone. We'll protect each other, all right?" He wouldn't let her go until I nodded. "All right," he repeated firmly. So we stayed together all day. First in the sheriff's office all morning, then for lunch to Mrs. Pratt's boarding house, where Emmett had a room, then back to Pa's office for the long, long afternoon. Nobody dropped in at the office to visit, and nobody sat near us during lunch. And when we walked home in the evening, Elijah Quinn crossed the street to avoid us. Loyal friend that he was. Emmett came home with us. "We'll stand watch all night," Pa said. "Emmett downstairs and me up. Annabelle will sleep in your room, Ben." He ruffled my hair, which in normal circumstances I would have complained against. "Nothing and nobody is getting in here," Pa assured us. "You going to stand there just looking at us while we sleep?" Annabelle asked. I didn't think I could sleep in those circumstances either, but Pa said he'd be in the hall with our door open. I wasn't especially scared at that particular moment, and Annabelle didn't seem to be either, since it was only just turning dark outside. I guess we figured whatever was coming would come in the still of the night. So Emmett was in the kitchen, washing up the supper dishes, and Pa was going from room to room, lighting a lamp in each so there wouldn't be any dark corners anywhere, when Annabelle suddenly remembered she'd left the photograph of Mama in her room. And that did scare her a bit, I could tell, the idea of going along that length of hallway all by herself to fetch it. "I'll get it," I offered. I didn't say, "Since you're scared to." I said, "That will give you time to change into your nightdress." Pa had already lit the light on her nightstand, and I found a picture right beside it. There we all were in our Sunday best. I looked so young it was hard to believe it really was me, except I remembered the photographer sticking his head under his black cloth, the flash of light, the lingering smell of powder. There was Annabelle with her blurry foot, and Pa with more hair than he'd had in a few years, and of course, Mama. We were all serious in the picture, but whenever I thought of Mama, I always remembered her laughing. The picture being black and white, her dress looked white, but it had really been palest blue. It smelled of cedar because she only wore it for special, and she'd taken it out of the chest shortly before the photographer arrived. It was the dress that, 2 years later, she'd been buried in. I headed back with the picture. In my room, Annabelle was sitting on my clothes chest under the window, not changed yet after all, which was supposed to be why she'd stayed behind. Instead, she was busy rummaging through a box of my things, snooping. What she had in her hand was the star card Zandra had given me. I knew what Annabelle would say, "Ooh, love," and I knew who she'd say it to, Elijah Quinn. To start with, I'd never hear the end of it. I opened my mouth, but before I got a chance to call her a sneaky little wretch, I saw something that froze the words into a solid lump in my throat. Right behind her, his face pressed against the window, was Jake Barnett. The picture dropped from my fingers and hit the floor with a crash that shattered the glass of the frame. Jake's gaze moved from the back of my sister's head to meet my eyes. He wasn't all rotted away, the way Elijah Quinn had said, and he wasn't all faint and wispy, the way I'd always pictured ghosts, except for the fact that he was muddy from the water that had seeped into his coffin. He looked pretty much like he must have when they'd laid him in there. But his neck was obviously broken. His head flopped to one side, just the way Elijah had mimed it for us the day of the hanging. The rope still dangled from his neck, though I doubted they had really buried him that way. Annabelle had jerked up at the sound of the picture frame breaking, and she saw where I was looking. She whirled around, but one glance at Jake, and she couldn't move either. Pa's voice called from his room down the hall. "Everything all right in there, Ben?" Jake grinned at us, with his head all lopsided. He touched the glass just inches from Annabelle's face, leaving a muddy smear. "Ben?" Pa called again, sudden anxiety in his voice. The muscles in my throat were too tight to get a sound out. It was like in a bad dream when you know if you could just holler out, you'd wake yourself up, but still, you just can't. Except that I knew this was no dream. "Annabelle?" I heard Pa step out into the hall. Jake apparently didn't need to hold on to anything to float up there, grinning into the second-story window. He put his finger to his lips, like we were all in on a secret. Pa was coming down the hall toward us. I could hear his footsteps falling heavy as he approached at a near run, and then he was shoving me out of his way. "Annie, down!" he commanded. I didn't know if he'd drawn his gun before entering the room or after seeing Jake, but it was in his hand now. Annabelle flung herself off the chest and onto the floor. The gun roared. The window shattered, taking the smear of mud with it, but not Jake Barnett. He still hung there, grinning. With the hand he'd used to touch the window, he pointed at each of us, Annabelle, me, Pa, and his lips formed the silent words, "And you, and you, and you." And then, finally, solid as he'd seemed, he dissolved into the surrounding blackness. Pa hugged us close to him. None of us said a word or made a sound. I could still smell the gunpowder the way I'd been able to smell the flash powder from the photographer. Outside, a couple of dogs who'd heard the gunshot were barking. Neighbors' doors were banging open. And in the silence of the house, his voice shaking because the house was so silent, finally Pa called, "Emmett?" That was chapter 13 of Ghost of a Hanged Man. Tune in tomorrow for chapter 14. And meanwhile, stay safe and be kind.